The Haunting of the Orphanage, a terrifying tale of darkness and revenge. I've always been drawn to the quiet solitude of the countryside. The way the rolling hills stretch out endlessly, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, it's all so serene. So, when my wife, Emily, and I found the large Victorian house tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the city, we knew it was perfect. A new start in an old house, rich with history and character. From the moment we stepped through the creaking front door, it felt like the house welcomed us. The grand staircase, the antique furniture left by the previous owners, and the wide, empty rooms, it was everything we dreamed of. Emily and I spent the first few days unpacking and making the place our own. It was on the third night, as we sat by the crackling fireplace, that we first heard it. Faint, at first. Just a whisper on the edge of our hearing. The soft, distant sound of children's laughter. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her brow furrowing. I nodded, straining to listen. It was unmistakable now, a chorus of playful giggles drifting through the air. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on us. After all, we were miles away from the nearest neighbor. But the laughter persisted. The next morning, I ventured out to explore the grounds. The house sat on a vast stretch of land, overgrown and wild. As I wandered, I stumbled upon the remnants of an old structure hidden among the weeds and twisted vines. Blackened bricks and charred wood stood as silent witnesses to a tragedy long past. Curiosity piqued, I did some research. I found that our new home stood on the site of an old orphanage that had burned down decades ago. The townsfolk whispered about it in hushed tones, speaking of the children who had perished in the flames, their lives cut tragically short. That night, the laughter grew louder. It echoed through the halls, accompanied by the pitter-patter of tiny feet. Emily was terrified, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to stay up and investigate. I sat in the living room, every light off, listening intently. The laughter began again, clear as day. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then I saw them. Shadowy figures darting through the dimly lit corridors, just out of reach. Children, their faces obscured, their laughter echoing like a macabre lullaby. I followed the sound, heart pounding in my chest, to a room at the end of the hall. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was empty. Silent. But the air was thick with the feeling of being watched. As I turned to leave, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The door slammed shut behind me, and the room plunged into darkness. The laughter stopped. Replaced by a low, ominous whisper. "Come play with us." Trapped in the dark room, my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The whispering continued, a chorus of soft, sinister voices beckoning me to join them. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling, but the room remained stubbornly dark. "Come play with us." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I reached for the doorknob, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, shouting for Emily, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Suddenly, the laughter resumed, louder, closer. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I recoiled, stumbling backward. The sensation was real, tangible, and utterly terrifying. In the faint light creeping in from under the door, I saw movement. Tiny silhouettes dancing and spinning around me, their laughter a symphony of madness. Desperation took hold. I kicked at the door with all my might, and finally, it gave way. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, and slammed the door shut behind me. Emily was standing there, her face pale with worry. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't find the words. Instead, I grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the room, away from the laughter that still echoed in my ears. The next day, I contacted the local historian, a man named Mr. Caldwell, hoping he could shed some light on the orphanage's history. He agreed to meet us at the house. When he arrived, his face turned grim as he looked at the remnants of the burned orphanage. "The orphanage burned down 50 years ago," he explained. "It was a tragedy. No one knows how the fire started, but many children lost their lives that night. Some say their spirits never left." "Do you think they're haunting us?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Caldwell sighed. "The land has a dark history. There were rumors that the headmistress was cruel, that the children were unhappy. Their laughter. It could be a cry for help or a sinister game they're still playing. We thanked him and he left us with a warning, be careful. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried." That night, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The once charming old home now felt like a prison, the walls closing in around us. The laughter started earlier, more insistent, and with it came a sense of dread that gnawed at my sanity. Emily and I decided to set up cameras around the house, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal activity. We wanted to understand what we were dealing with. As I reviewed the footage from the first night, my blood ran cold. On the screen, shadowy figures moved through the halls, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They flitted from room to room, their laughter echoing eerily through the speakers. In one frame, a figure stood at the foot of our bed, watching us sleep. Emily gasped when she saw it, her hand flying to her mouth. "We can't stay here," she said, tears welling in her eyes. But something compelled me to stay, a dark curiosity mixed with a sense of obligation. I needed to know what happened to those children, to put their spirits to rest if I could. That's when I found the journal. Hidden in a secret compartment in the attic, it was the diary of the orphanage's headmistress. Her words were chilling, describing her disdain for the children and the cruel punishments she inflicted. The last entry was smeared with ash and ended abruptly. "They are planning something. I can hear them whispering. I fear." The final word was smudged beyond recognition, but I didn't need to read it to know. The children had risen against her, their laughter a prelude to something far more sinister. And now, they had us. The discovery of the journal plunged us deeper into the horrifying mystery of our new home. The headmistress's cruelty and the children's vengeful laughter painted a chilling picture. But what terrified me most was the realization that we were not just dealing with lost spirits, we were dealing with something far darker. Emily and I spent the next day scouring the journal for clues. The headmistress had documented her disdain for the children in great detail, but it was the last few entries that caught my attention. Her paranoia had grown, her writing more erratic. She spoke of seeing shadows in the corners of her vision, hearing whispers in the dead of night. It was as if the children were tormenting her even before the fire. I was convinced that if we could understand what had happened that night, we might find a way to put the spirits to rest. But Emily was losing hope. The constant laughter, the whispers, and the shadowy figures had taken a toll on her. She wanted to leave, to abandon the house and never look back. But I couldn't. That night, I stayed up late again, watching the footage from our cameras. The laughter began as usual, and the figures appeared, moving through the house with eerie grace. But this time, something different happened. One of the shadowy figures stopped in front of the camera in the living room. It turned slowly, as if aware it was being watched. For a moment, it seemed to look directly into the lens, its face a blur of darkness. Then, it raised a hand and pointed, straight at me. I recoiled, my heart racing. The figure held its position for a few seconds before vanishing. I rewound the footage and watched it again, hoping I had imagined it. But no, the figure had pointed at me. The following day, I decided to explore the remains of the orphanage more thoroughly. I wanted to find any clues that might help us understand the haunting. Emily reluctantly agreed to come with me, though fear was etched on her face. As we sifted through the charred rubble, I found something half buried under a pile of debris, a small, rusted key. It seemed insignificant, but something about it felt important. We continued searching until Emily found a trapdoor, hidden beneath a layer of dirt and ash. The key fit perfectly. With a sense of trepidation, we opened the trapdoor. A set of narrow stairs descended into darkness. We exchanged a glance, and I could see the fear in Emily's eyes. But there was no turning back now. We descended into the cold, damp cellar, our footsteps echoing ominously. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a small room lined with old wooden shelves. The shelves were filled with dusty jars and faded photographs of the children who had lived in the orphanage. In the center of the room was a small, makeshift altar. On it lay a collection of old toys, each one charred and blackened. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized these were the children's belongings, gathered here as if in some macabre tribute. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the air grew heavy. The laughter started again, louder and more malicious. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, coalescing into dark, twisted forms. The children's faces were now visible, their eyes hollow and filled with anger. Emily screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the stairs. But as we turned to flee, a force slammed the trapdoor shut, trapping us in the darkness. The laughter grew deafening, and the figures closed in, their eyes burning with a malevolent light. In a moment of sheer terror, I realized the truth. The children's spirits were not just playing, they were seeking revenge. And we were their new targets. The oppressive silence in the house was almost worse than the laughter. Emily and I moved cautiously, our nerves frayed and our senses heightened. The sense of relief from freeing the children's spirits was short-lived, overshadowed by a growing feeling of dread. Something had shifted, something darker had awakened. The headmistress's journal, now our only guide, lay open on the kitchen table. The final entries, smeared with ash and nearly illegible, spoke of a malevolent force lurking within the orphanage. Her last written words were clear: "I fear it is not the children I should worry about. It is something else. Something darker." Emily and I pored over the journal, desperate to find any clues that might help us understand what we were facing. The headmistress had been a practitioner of dark arts, but she was also a pawn in a larger, more sinister game. The true malevolence she had hinted at was something ancient and far more dangerous. The journal mentioned a guardian of shadows, an entity that fed on fear and despair. It had been drawn to the orphanage by the suffering of the children and had taken root there, growing stronger with each passing year. The headmistress had tried to control it, but in the end, it had consumed her. "We need to find where this guardian is anchored," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "If we can destroy its anchor, we might be able to banish it for good." Emily nodded, her determination mirroring mine. "But where do we start?" The answer came to us in the form of a memory. The altar in the cellar, where we had performed the ritual to free the children's spirits, had been surrounded by charred toys and photographs. These items had a connection to the children, and it made sense that something similar might anchor the guardian. We decided to search the house for anything that seemed out of place, anything that might have a connection to the dark entity. As we moved from room to room, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air colder. The house seemed to resist our efforts, the shadows lengthening and twisting in unnatural ways. In the attic, we found an old trunk, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside were items that didn't belong, ancient relics, strange artifacts, and a blackened, ornate box that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "This has to be it," Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. As we reached for the box, a sudden force knocked us back. The air grew thick with a dark, oppressive energy, and the shadows in the attic came alive. The guardian was aware of our presence, and it was not going to let us destroy its anchor without a fight. The shadows coalesced into a towering figure, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It moved toward us with an unnatural grace, its form shifting and pulsating with malevolent energy. "Foolish mortals," it hissed, its voice echoing through the attic. "You cannot defeat me. Your fear only makes me stronger." I stood my ground, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're not afraid of you," I lied, hoping to buy us some time. "We know how to end this." Emily began to chant from the book, her voice strong and unwavering. The guardian recoiled, its form flickering. It let out a deafening roar, and the attic shook violently. The floor beneath us creaked and groaned, threatening to collapse. As Emily continued the incantation, I grabbed the blackened box and opened it. Inside was a small, ancient idol, its eyes glowing with a dark light. This was the guardian's anchor, the source of its power. With all my strength, I smashed the idol against the floor. The reaction was immediate and violent. The guardian let out a scream that reverberated through the entire house, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows. The dark energy in the attic intensified, and for a moment, I thought we wouldn't survive. But as the idol shattered into pieces, the oppressive energy lifted. The shadows retreated, and the air grew lighter. The guardian's form flickered one last time before disappearing entirely, leaving behind an eerie silence. Emily and I stood there, panting and covered in sweat. The house felt different, no longer a place of fear and despair, but one of quiet and peace. We had done it. We had banished the darkness. But as we descended the attic stairs, a nagging doubt crept into my mind. The headmistress's journal had mentioned another entity, one even more powerful and malevolent. The dark force we had just banished was not the end. It was only the beginning. The house, now quiet and seemingly at peace, still carried a lingering sense of unease. Despite our victory over the guardian, the headmistress's ominous warnings haunted my thoughts. Emily and I decided to take a break, hoping to clear our minds and regain some semblance of normalcy. But deep down, we knew the battle wasn't over. As the days passed, the oppressive atmosphere that had once filled the house seemed to dissipate. We tried to settle into a routine, but there was always a nagging feeling that something was watching, waiting. Emily spent hours in the garden, trying to reclaim some of the overgrown land, while I focused on repairs inside the house. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that we received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Caldwell, the local historian who had helped us before, arrived at our doorstep. His face was grave, his eyes filled with concern. "I've been doing more research," he said, his voice low. "There are stories, legends about this area. Dark tales that go back centuries." We invited him in, eager to hear what he had discovered. Over cups of tea, he unfolded a tale that chilled us to the bone. The land our house stood on had a long history of darkness and death. Long before the orphanage, it was a place of ancient rituals, where a cult worshipped an entity known only as the Eternal One. This Eternal One, Mr. Caldwell explained, is believed to be an ancient being of immense power, feeding on fear and suffering. The headmistress likely tapped into this power, awakening it with her dark practices. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The guardian we had defeated was merely a servant, a herald of this greater evil. The true malevolence, the Eternal One, was still out there. "We need to find a way to stop it," Emily said, her voice firm. "We can't let it continue." Mr. Caldwell nodded. "There is a way, but it's dangerous." The cult believed that the Eternal One could be banished by performing a powerful ritual at the site of its original summoning. "You need to find that place and complete the ritual." The thought of confronting this ancient evil filled me with dread, but we had no choice. The peace we had found was fleeting, and the darkness would return. We had to end it, once and for all. With Mr. Caldwell's guidance, we began to piece together the clues. The original summoning site was somewhere on the property, hidden and forgotten. As we searched, the house seemed to come alive with whispers and shadows, a constant reminder of the evil we faced. In the basement, we discovered a hidden passage behind an old bookshelf. The passage led to a cavernous underground chamber, its walls covered in the same dark symbols we had seen before. In the center of the chamber was an ancient stone altar, similar to the one in the hidden room, but far more elaborate. "This is it," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This is where it began." We prepared for the ritual, gathering the necessary items and memorizing the incantations. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with anticipation. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own, and the temperature dropped sharply. As we stood around the altar, the sense of dread intensified. Emily and I held hands, our voices steady as we began to chant the incantation. The ground beneath us trembled, and the shadows coalesced into a dark, towering figure, the Eternal One. Its presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that filled the chamber. The Eternal One's eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its voice echoed in our minds, a chorus of agony and despair. "You dare to challenge me?" it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Your fear will be my feast." We continued the chant, our voices growing louder and more determined. The symbols on the walls glowed with an eerie light, and the air crackled with energy. The Eternal One writhed and twisted, its form flickering and unstable. With a final, earth-shaking roar, the Eternal One lunged at us, its claws outstretched. But as it reached the altar, a blinding light erupted from the symbols, enveloping the dark figure. The chamber filled with a deafening scream, and the ground shook violently. The light intensified, forcing us to shield our eyes. When it finally faded, the chamber was silent. The Eternal One was gone, its presence erased from existence. We stood there, breathless and trembling, the weight of our victory slowly sinking in. The darkness had been banished, and the house felt lighter, freer. But as we made our way back to the surface, a nagging doubt lingered in my mind. Had we truly defeated the Eternal One? Or was this just another beginning? The house, now eerily silent, seemed almost serene. Emily and I emerged from the underground chamber, our bodies and minds exhausted but filled with a cautious sense of relief. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted us for so long was gone, and the air felt fresh and light. For the next few days, we reveled in the peace we had fought so hard to achieve. Mr. Caldwell visited frequently, helping us document everything we had experienced and ensuring the history of the land was preserved accurately. The children's laughter had ceased, replaced by a comforting silence. But as the days turned into weeks, a subtle unease began to creep back into our lives. It was small things at first, a cold draft, a flickering light, the feeling of being watched. We tried to dismiss it as residual fear, but the signs grew more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself drawn to the hidden passage in the basement. Something compelled me to return to the chamber, to ensure that the Eternal One was truly gone. Emily, sensing my unease, insisted on coming with me. Armed with flashlights, we descended the stairs and entered the chamber. The symbols on the walls had faded, and the air was thick with dust. It felt like a tomb, undisturbed and forgotten. But as we approached the altar, a sense of dread settled over us. In the center of the altar lay the shattered remains of the ancient idol. As I stared at the fragments, a chilling realization washed over me. The Eternal One's power hadn't been destroyed, it had merely been released. "Emily," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We didn't banish it. We freed it." Before she could respond, the chamber filled with an overwhelming darkness. The shadows on the walls began to move, coalescing into a familiar, towering figure. The Eternal One, more powerful and malevolent than before, loomed over us, its eyes burning with a dark, unholy light. "You cannot escape me," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of tortured souls. "You have merely set me free." Emily and I backed away, our hearts pounding with terror. The Eternal One advanced, its form shifting and pulsating with dark energy. We needed to find a way to contain it, to undo the ritual that had set it free. In a moment of desperate clarity, I remembered the symbols we had used to banish the Guardian. If we could recreate the ritual, we might be able to imprison the Eternal One once more. Emily and I quickly drew the symbols on the ground, our hands shaking with fear. As we chanted the incantation, the chamber trembled, and the air grew thick with energy. The Eternal One let out a deafening roar, its form flickering and unstable. The symbols glowed with a blinding light, and the ground shook violently. With a final, earth-shattering scream, the Eternal One lunged at us. But as it reached the center of the symbols, a burst of light erupted from the ground, enveloping the dark figure. The chamber filled with a blinding radiance, and the air crackled with raw energy. When the light finally faded, the Eternal One was gone. The chamber was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. But this time, the symbols on the ground remained glowing, a constant reminder of the dark force we had contained. We stood there, breathless and trembling, the weight of our victory slowly sinking in. The Eternal One had been imprisoned once more, its power sealed within the chamber. But as we made our way back to the surface, a chilling thought lingered in my mind. The house, the land, it was a place of darkness, a beacon for malevolent forces. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The true malevolence, the darkness that had drawn the Eternal One here, still lingered, waiting for its next opportunity. As we stepped into the cool night air, Emily took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. We had faced unimaginable horrors and emerged victorious, but we knew that our journey was far from over. The house, with its dark history and hidden secrets, would always be a place of danger and intrigue. But together, we would face whatever came next. The shadows might return, the darkness might rise again, but we would be ready. For we had faced the darkness and survived, and we would do so again. The house stood silent, the wind rustling through the trees. The children's laughter was gone, replaced by a peaceful silence. But as the moon rose high in the sky, casting its pale light over the land, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. For in the depths of the house, in the shadows that lingered just beyond the edge of the light, something watched and waited. And the echoes of darkness whispered a chilling promise. We will return. The end.